In the early 2000s, South Korea was experiencing rapid economic growth, technology booms, and a shifting social landscape. The country, which had quickly transformed from a war-torn nation into an industrial powerhouse, was now home to an increasingly affluent society. Urbanization had surged, bringing both prosperity and the challenges of dense city life. In cities like Seoul, skyscrapers and modern apartments towered over traditional neighborhoods, while the gap between the wealthy and those struggling on the economic fringes grew more apparent. Amid the glossy high-rise buildings and the fast-paced lives of a society obsessed with success, there were underlying issues: social inequality, unemployment among the youth, and rising crime rates, that contributed to a simmering discontent and unease. It was during this period of profound change and hidden anxieties that one of the most horrifying serial killers in South Korean history would emerge. The case of Young-chul would expose an aspect of society that had remained in the shadows, challenging not only law enforcement but also the collective sense of security among the people. Yu's crimes, brutal, systematic, and seemingly without remorse, struck terror into the hearts of citizens and revealed a level of darkness that seemed to contrast sharply with the country's image of modernity and progress. For months, Yu preyed on vulnerable members of society, targeting elderly wealthy individuals and later women from marginalized backgrounds, particularly those working in the adult entertainment industry. The randomness and brutality of his murders heightened public anxiety, making people feel unsafe in their own homes and daily routines. At the time, South Korea's police force was relatively inexperienced in handling the complexities of serial murder cases. Though they had dealt with occasional high-profile crimes, the scale and nature of Yu's atrocities presented an unprecedented challenge. The country lacked the specialized resources and forensic expertise that were more common in Western countries. Serial killings were something South Korea had rarely faced. Most crime was petty or economically motivated, and violence on this level was uncommon. The media quickly picked up on the terror spreading through communities and reported on each gruesome discovery with fervor, feeding a growing atmosphere of panic. Newspapers and television channels followed every development in the case, and rumors about the killer's profile circulated widely, adding to the fear and confusion. People began to question whether the police were capable of stopping this faceless predator who had so seamlessly evaded capture. Young-chul's background was typical in many ways of those left behind in South Korea's swift economic rise. Yet he harbored a darkness that defied comprehension. Born into poverty, Yu faced numerous hardships from a young age, experiencing neglect and societal rejection that left him with a profound sense of anger and alienation. His resentment festered over the years, transforming into a warped perspective on society and its structures. Yu's violent tendencies and deep-seated bitterness led him down a path of crime, initially in the form of petty thefts and later escalating into unspeakable acts of brutality. To the outside world, he was largely invisible, a man whose life was marked by hardship and failure, seemingly unremarkable amidst the vast urban landscape. However, beneath this facade lay a ruthless predator who would soon embark on a chilling and calculated killing spree. As the string of murders continued, South Koreans became gripped by an intense fear, wondering if they would be the next victims of the elusive killer who roamed freely in their midst. This anxiety seeped into daily life, changing the way people viewed their own safety and their surroundings. Many found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders or double-checking that their doors were locked. Families and friends warned each other to be vigilant, and in neighborhoods where the crimes had occurred, residents were reluctant to go out after dark. Yu's actions seemed to embody a growing fear of the other, an unknown force lurking within society, hidden in plain sight yet capable of unspeakable violence. The case sparked important conversations in South Korea about the widening social divide and the consequences of neglecting the marginalized. Yu's choice of victims, elderly, affluent individuals and later, young women in vulnerable professions, highlighted societal imbalances and prompted debates about the treatment of marginalized groups, including those in the sex work industry who often lacked protection and support. This case highlighted cracks in South Korea's rapid development and the resulting societal challenges that had been overlooked in the rush toward progress. The apprehension of Young-chul would not come easily, as his elusiveness and meticulous nature allowed him to evade law enforcement for months. His methods of targeting and murdering were shockingly systematic and precise, leaving investigators confounded. His motives and chilling lack of remorse, once revealed, would shock the public and permanently alter South Korea's sense of safety. But in the beginning, he was a ghost, an anonymous, faceless figure who moved unnoticed among the public. The police, the media, and the public alike found themselves drawn into a horrifying game of cat and mouse. One that would expose the weaknesses of a society facing its first encounter with true, unrelenting evil. The case of Young-chul remains one of South Korea's most disturbing criminal sagas. Not only because of the violence he inflicted but also because of what it revealed about the pressures and inequalities simmering beneath the country's modern facade. It forced a reckoning with issues of mental health, the lack of support systems for the disadvantaged, and the vulnerability of those society deemed less worthy of protection. Even as South Korea progressed into a new era of prosperity, Yu's crimes underscored the importance of addressing the needs of all citizens to prevent such tragedies from reoccurring. His actions were a stark reminder that within even the most advanced societies, there are fractures and dark corners where resentment and rage can fester, unseen, until it's too late. Analyzing the central conflict within Young-chul's criminal psyche requires a close examination of his motivations, inner turmoil, and the external influences that fueled his horrific actions. Yu's crimes reflected a disturbing internal struggle between personal grievances, deep-seated rage, and a twisted sense of societal retribution. This analysis will delve into the psychological and sociological factors that shaped Yu's path, examining the core conflicts that drove his violent behavior. I'll approach this analysis by breaking down the following main areas. 1. Background and formation of societal resentment. To understand Yu's actions, we must first explore his early life, marked by poverty, neglect, and marginalization. These formative experiences contributed to his belief that society had wronged him, laying the foundation for a sense of bitter resentment that would later fuel his actions. Yu's conflicts are rooted in a distorted perception of social justice, where he viewed the wealthy and the vulnerable in society as targets representing his personal frustrations and feelings of inadequacy. 2. Conflict between desire for revenge and need for power. Yu's initial motives appeared to stem from a desire for revenge against societal elites. By targeting wealthy elderly individuals, he believed he was punishing the affluent class. However, his motives evolved as he developed a need to exert control and power over vulnerable women. This shift highlights a central conflict within him. His need for revenge transformed into a need for dominance, revealing a power-driven dimension of his psyche. 3. Inner conflict and rationalization of actions. One of Yu's defining traits was his ability to rationalize his heinous acts. He justified his crimes by framing them as a twisted form of justice. This inner conflict, where his perception of morality was distorted, allowed him to continue his violent spree without remorse. His rationale shows a profound psychological conflict, where he believed his acts were a societal cleansing, thus distancing himself from the guilt typically associated with murder. 4. Isolation and disdain for society. Yu's lack of close relationships and intense social isolation contributed to his disdain for society. He viewed himself as an outsider, feeding his feelings of anger and resentment. This societal alienation created a self-perpetuating cycle of violence and hatred, as he increasingly saw himself as separate from societal norms and values. His isolation reinforced his need to lash out, seeing his crimes as a form of twisted rebellion against a society he believed had cast him aside. 5. Evolving motivations and the impact of his conflicts on victims. Yu's conflicts evolved over time as his motives shifted from revenge against the rich to aggression against vulnerable women. This progression in his targets and methods reflects the deepening of his internal struggles, where his hatred became indiscriminate. His conflict was no longer solely with societal elites but expanded to encompass anyone he saw as weak or impure. This evolution highlights the impact of his internal conflicts on his victims and the brutal ways he manifested his anger. Let's proceed to analyze each of these conflicts in detail. 1. Background and formation of societal resentment. Yu's resentment toward society began early in life, shaped by his experiences of poverty, neglect, and lack of educational or economic opportunities. Growing up marginalized, he likely felt society had deprived him of basic dignities, fueling his deep-seated hatred toward those who appeared to have the lives he could never attain. His poverty was not just financial, it was also a poverty of relationships, belonging, and respect. As he grew older, his resentment solidified, evolving from a passive sense of inferiority into active hatred. This formed the basis of his violent ideology, a belief that he was entitled to enact revenge against the affluent, whom he saw as symbols of the social structures that kept him powerless and alienated. 2. Conflict between desire for revenge and need for power. Initially, Yu targeted affluent elderly individuals, seeing them as representatives of a wealthy society he despised. His actions can be interpreted as an expression of revenge, an attempt to balance the injustices he felt by attacking those he associated with power and privilege. However, as his crimes continued, his motives shifted. Yu's focus expanded from targeting the wealthy to victimizing women, specifically those working in marginalized professions such as sex work. This shift illustrates a fundamental internal conflict. While his initial desire was to seek revenge on the upper class, his actions eventually revealed a different, darker need to exert power and control. Yu's need to dominate and subjugate his victims exposed a dual conflict in his psyche. On one hand, he was motivated by a warped sense of justice, viewing his actions as a means to punish those he felt were corrupt or morally inferior. On the other hand, this mission was also an outlet for his own insecurities and frustrations. By controlling and harming others, he gained a fleeting sense of power that he lacked in his own life, suggesting that his actions were as much about satisfying his own ego as they were about fulfilling any social vendetta. 3. Inner conflict and rationalization of actions. Yu's ability to rationalize his actions is perhaps one of the most striking aspects of his personality. He viewed himself as a kind of vigilante, tasked with cleansing society. This internal justification enabled him to commit murder without apparent remorse, reflecting a deeply entrenched psychological conflict. By framing his crimes as acts of justice, Yu detached himself from the moral and ethical implications of his behavior. His twisted belief that he was enacting a form of justice reveals a profound internal struggle. He was not simply killing for personal gain but rather to fulfill a self-appointed role as society's punisher. This rationalization reflects Yu's need to mitigate his feelings of guilt and self-loathing. By convincing himself that his victims deserved their fate, he could continue his spree without facing the full weight of his conscience. In this sense, Yu's conflict was both moral and existential. He struggled to reconcile his actions with his desire to be right, which led him to adopt a worldview that justified his brutality. This internal narrative helped Yu maintain a semblance of control, even as his crimes grew increasingly violent and irrational. 4. Isolation and disdain for society. Yu's social isolation intensified his resentment and disdain for society, fueling his desire for revenge. Having grown up without meaningful connections, he viewed himself as separate from the world around him, which likely fostered his lack of empathy. His detachment from social norms allowed him to view his victims not as individuals but as objects in his twisted mission. This isolation also contributed to a sense of entitlement, where he felt justified in taking lives to fulfill his desire for retribution. The self-imposed isolation fed into Yu's distorted worldview. He became increasingly detached from reality, seeing himself as a lone arbiter of justice. This sense of detachment from society only deepened his contempt, fueling a cycle of violence that allowed him to justify his actions. Yu's conflict with society was thus twofold. He felt rejected and marginalized, and in turn, he rejected societal norms and values, allowing him to act without remorse. 5. Evolving motivations and the impact of his conflicts on victims. As Yu's crimes continued, his motivations and targets evolved. Initially driven by revenge against the wealthy, he later targeted women in marginalized professions. This change reflects an escalation in his internal conflicts. where his hatred became more indiscriminate, and his anger turned towards those he deemed vulnerable or impure. Yu's conflict was no longer focused solely on societal elites. It expanded to include anyone he viewed as morally inferior or deserving of punishment. This progression highlights the deepening of Yu's inner struggles. His attacks on marginalized individuals reveal a sense of moral superiority, where he believed he had the right to decide who deserved to live or die. His evolving motives and expanding targets demonstrate the widening scope of his internal conflicts. By the end of his spree, his actions had become expressions of pure rage and hatred, reflecting the unresolved anger that had festered within him for years. Conclusion: Young-chul's crimes were the result of complex and conflicting motivations. Rooted in a lifetime of societal resentment, isolation, and a distorted moral compass, his inner conflicts reveal a man consumed by rage, who justified his acts as a form of retribution against a society he believed had wronged him. His evolution from a marginalized outsider to a ruthless predator illustrates the destructive power of unchecked resentment and the consequences of a fractured psyche. By examining Yu's inner turmoil and the shifting nature of his motivations, we can better understand the disturbing psychological landscape that fueled one of South Korea's most notorious criminals. 1. The final crime scene. A botched attempt. The story reaches its height as Yu, driven by his growing paranoia and sense of urgency, decides to target another victim late one night. Unlike his previous meticulous preparations, he is becoming careless, rushing through his usual planning due to the increasing police presence and the weight of public attention. His mind is frayed, and his once sharp instincts are clouded by impatience and fury. This time, his anger takes precedence over his caution. He breaks into the apartment of a young woman whom he had observed briefly, assuming she lives alone, but a friend is staying with her that night. The scene is chaotic. Yu, who usually operates under a cloak of silence, is surprised when the second person enters the room, screaming and alerting neighbors. He lashes out, desperate to maintain control, but the situation spirals. Sirens are heard in the distance, and he realizes he's made a critical error. Rather than completing his horrific mission, he flees, leaving evidence behind, a departure from his usual methodical approach. This moment serves as a psychological climax for Yu, symbolizing the crumbling of the carefully constructed facade he had maintained. His confidence in his ability to evade capture is shaken, and he becomes increasingly paranoid. For the first time, Yu feels hunted, sensing that he may be losing his grip on the freedom he had taken for granted. 2. Breakthrough in the investigation. The detectives resolve. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, the detectives, frustrated yet more determined than ever, find themselves faced with the breakthrough they've been hoping for. Evidence from the botched crime scene, including DNA and partial fingerprints, finally provides them with a solid lead. They realize that the killer they've been chasing is not only getting bolder but also beginning to slip up, leaving behind clues that indicate a growing desperation. A seasoned detective, haunted by the mounting victims and their families' grief, becomes the focal point in this part of the climax. He has been working day and night on the case, poring over witness statements, crime scene photographs, and psychological profiles to build a clear picture of Yu's motivations and movements. This breakthrough breathes new life into the investigation. The detective's resolve is rekindled, and he doubles down, setting up a citywide alert and tasking his team to comb through the underbelly of Seoul in search of Yu. 3. A deadly game of cat and mouse. Yu on the run. As Yu realizes that the police are closer than ever, he goes on the run, leaving his usual haunts and attempting to hide in less populated areas of the city. His mental state deteriorates rapidly under the pressure. For someone who has spent years seeing himself as an apex predator, the sudden role reversal, becoming the hunted, creates a disturbing shift in his mind. His anger turns to panic, and his sense of power crumbles. Yu starts seeing everyone as a potential threat, his paranoia mounts, and he becomes erratic, more dangerous than ever. In a tense game of cat and mouse, Yu evades capture by constantly changing locations, sleeping in abandoned buildings and alleys. He watches the news obsessively, witnessing the citywide manhunt and feeling the walls closing in around him. The police, now aware of his habits and psychology, begin setting up traps, closing off parts of the city, and increasing surveillance. The detective in charge, determined to prevent further loss of life, makes it his personal mission to capture you. He orders his team to sweep every area you could be hiding, reaching out to informants and locals who might have information. Days stretch into a long, sleepless week as the police pursue every possible lead. 4. The final confrontation. One evening, Yu's location is compromised when a civilian recognizes him from the televised reports and alerts the authorities. The police swarm the area, and Yu, realizing he has nowhere left to hide, decides to make a final stand in a crowded, dimly lit part of the city. The detective arrives on the scene, setting the stage for the ultimate confrontation between the relentless pursuer and the cornered predator. The atmosphere is tense, with police officers surrounding the area, weapons drawn, urging Yu to surrender. Yu, however, is beyond rationality. His mind races with anger and betrayal. He sees the crowd around him, including the police, as embodiments of the society he despises. In his final act of defiance, he shouts accusations at those around him, revealing the full extent of his twisted worldview. The detective steps forward, attempting to negotiate with Yu, hoping to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. He carefully approaches, speaking in a calm, steady voice, trying to break through Yu's psychological walls. He appeals to whatever humanity might be left in Yu, urging him to surrender peacefully. For a brief moment, Yu hesitates, his gaze meeting the detective's, and an eerie silence fills the space. But just as quickly, Yu's resolve hardens. He is unwilling to submit, unwilling to relinquish the sense of power he has clung to. In a final, desperate lunge, Yu attempts to attack the detective. The officers, left with no choice, take action, subduing him and finally bringing his reign of terror to an end. 5. Aftermath and psychological impact. With Yu in custody, the city breathes a collective sigh of relief, though the scars of his crimes remain deeply imprinted on the community. The detective, now free of the intense pursuit, reflects on the toll the case has taken on him and his team. The victory is bittersweet, the lives lost and the families affected weigh heavily on his conscience. And he realizes that the end of the case does not erase the trauma left behind. Yu's capture leads to a highly publicized trial, during which the full extent of his crimes and twisted motivations come to light. The detective is called to testify, recounting the horrors of the case and the grueling months spent tracking a man who operated without empathy or remorse. He watches as Yu faces justice, but the detective knows that true closure may be out of reach for the victims and their families. The case leaves a lasting impact on South Korea, sparking conversations about mental health, criminal justice, and societal responsibility. The detective himself becomes a symbol of resilience and dedication, but he carries the haunting memories of the investigation long after the case is closed. In the end, Yu's story serves as a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk within society and the importance of vigilance, empathy, and justice in protecting those most vulnerable.